Okay, we're picking up now with question 27 of the June 2016 U.S. History Regents. Okay, so this is one of those, for want of a better word, document multiple choice questions. Regents exam tends to like to give a few of these. So sometimes it's a political cartoon, sometimes it's an image, a photograph, such as this one. Could be a variety of things. So in this case, we have picture, and they tell you what it is, the Dust Bowl of 1936. So let's take a moment to review the Dust Bowl. Okay, so don't make a mistake about the Dust Bowl. Sometimes it comes up in a multiple choice, sometimes in an essay. The Dust Bowl was neither caused by the Depression, nor did it cause the Depression. It was an independent event that happened to take place at exactly the wrong time for the nation. As you remember, the stock market crash happens in October of 1929. And as I've tried to emphasize to you in class, the stock market crash did not cause the Depression, nor was it really the beginning of the Depression. It was just the most obvious symptom of something that had been going on for a while. The early 1920s, farm prices had begun to collapse. Why? Overproduction. Once more, basic law of all economics is supply and demand. The more you have of something that people want, the less each unit of it is worth. So if people want wheat to make bread and eat and so on, if it's hard to get wheat, there's only a few bushels around, people pay a lot of money for it. If it's easy, if there's warehouses full of it, you can only charge $1 a bushel. Well, early 1920s, you had had the, and maybe we should put this up here. Okay, so if I can get this to work. Early 1920s, what do you have? Better plows. Now, what did that do? It allows you to cut into the soil more deeply. The Great Plains of the United States are prairie. And the prairie is wide, more or less flat expanses of land, rich, good soil, but on top of it is a very thick layer of grasses, grass and grass roots. So imagine having a great soil covered by this very thick carpet that is pretty hard to penetrate. Better plows meant that you could cut more deeply into that soil, cut that carpet open, sort of peel it off, and now you had all that great soil underneath. Second thing that you had was the internal combustion engine. So cars, which meant tractors. Now tractors can plow more quickly, less manpower, and no horses. And all of that, see, if you think like a historian, all of that makes a difference. So now you could plow, a farmer, instead of plowing, a couple of acres, could plow, a few dozen acres pretty easily. That meant that you needed fewer people to work the farms. They became available then to go into the cities to look for work, and they had to because the farm, there wasn't enough jobs on the farm. And no horses. No horses meant no hay fields. So if you've got a horse, you've got to feed the horse, which means you've got to keep at least a couple of your fields for grass and hay so that they have something to eat and exercise in. But that means more land for farming. So if you put it all together, what happens in the early 1920s? Farming is becoming more efficient. It's opening up all new kinds of property and land. There's more and more land that can be farmed. It's producing more and more produce then, more wheat, more corn, more oats, more barley, more all of that stuff out of the farm. And as Europe comes back, less demand. So when Europe was in the throes of the war, World War I, they were buying an awful lot of grain and stuff from the U.S. But as Europe comes out of the war in the 1920s, and they benefit from all of this too, there's more and more food being produced over there. They need to buy less and less. So what does that all lead to? Oversupply of farm goods. So now, because there's so much wheat and barley and oats and corn being produced, each bushel is worth less and less. Let me also point out a couple of other things that are in the background of this, right? One is that farmers, as I've told you guys in class, farmers are always in debt. So they borrow money in the spring because they've got a plant, right? That's G there. So you borrow money, you're a farmer, and in March, April, you borrow money from the bank to buy seed, to buy fertilizer, to buy fuel for your tractor, to do repairs and stuff on your farm equipment, all of that stuff that you're going to invest. They use the farm as collateral. So what is collateral? If a bank loans you money, how do they know they're going to get their money back? They want a guarantee. So you promise to pay them back, and if you don't pay them back, they get something of yours. When you borrow money for a house, the house is the collateral. So if you don't make your mortgage payments, mortgage is a loan for land, if you don't make your mortgage payments, the bank comes and takes your house away. If you're a farmer and you don't make your farm payments, the bank comes and takes your farm. The farm, though, is your business and your home. So if you don't make your payment, the bank takes the farm, they get the land, and then they hope to resell the land and make some of their money back. And you are stuck with no place to live, no job, no way to make any money again. So farming is a very risky business. You are constantly in debt to the bank. Every year you're in debt. And every year, both your business and your home are kind of on the line. Okay, so here's the thing. Farmers like inflation. Why would they like inflation? Well, because if I borrow money in the spring, let's say we're going to make it stupid easy, right? $1,000. Okay? I need 1,000 bushels of wheat because each bushel of wheat is $1 to make that money back, and then I can pay the bank back in the fall. Right? Okay. Suppose the price of a bushel of wheat goes from $1 to $2. If that's the case, I make $2,000. I pay the bank back their $1,000. I made $1,000 profit. Suppose the price of wheat goes to 50 cents a bushel. Now I only make what? Oops, we'll do this. $500. I still owe the bank the other 500. And I can't pay it. They're going to take my farm. So I want the price to go up. Inflation is good for me. Here's the problem. What does oversupply do? It drives prices down. If there's too much of something on the market, people are going to pay less to get it. So, as overproduction took place all through the 1920s, farmers started chasing their tails. They borrow $1,000, 1,000 bushels of wheat. That's not going to do it, so they need now 2,000 bushels of wheat. So they produce 2,000 because it's only 50 cents a piece. Except now that there's 2,000 bushels of wheat out there in the market, now people are only going to pay 25 cents. So now I have to produce 4,000 bushels of wheat, which is going to drive the price down to 10 cents a bushel. So now I have to, you see the kind of cycle that you wind up with. Okay, now what has any of this got to do with the Dust Bowl? Oh, I should also point out, by the way, a lot of poor farmers were also sharecroppers. That's important to know. Sharecropper doesn't own land. He rents it. And he rents it for a percentage of the crop. So if I own a piece of property, I am not going to work it myself as a farmer. So I rent it as both a home and as a farm. So there's a house on it, family lives in it, they work the farm. They owe me a certain amount of money, a certain percentage of the crop they produce. The problem is this: as the price of that crop falls, I still get the percentage of the crop, but they're making less and less money. So if they give me half the crop, they keep half the crop. They sell their half of the crop. Now they take that cash and they live on it. They buy food, they buy, shoes for the kids, all of that. But that amount, that 50% of the crop that they're getting, that's worth less and less. So they got less and less cash. So they have less and less money to spend on like food. So now they have to borrow money from the bank in order to buy stuff that they need. Now they owe more money to the bank and the crop isn't paying for it. So the sharecroppers are in the worst situation of all. Okay. Let's talk about then the Dust Bowl. So by 1929, before that stock market crash takes place, the farm economy was already shot. Long before the, quote, Great Depression sort of hits the rest of America, farmers already were struggling in a Great Depression. Second thing that happens, just happens to happen at the same time: drought. The Midwest of the United States went through a period of some of the lowest rain levels it had had in a very long time. Third thing that has happened: tree clearance. So all through the Midwest, you had these big farms, but between the farms, and randomly sort of here and there, you would have little clumps of trees, lines of trees that kind of were the border between farms. They weren't just pretty. They served as windbreaks. So the wind would come down over this big flat land, and the trees would break it up at least a little bit. They couldn't really stop the wind, but they'd break up that steady wind. So we take the trees out. It's easier to farm if there's no trees. So they knock all of the trees down. They cut down all of those tree stands. And they've laid bare the prairie. They've dug in, ripped all of that sod, which is that grassy sort of carpet that lay on top. They've cut it into pieces, ripped it up, and now you've got the bare soil, good soil, but bare soil, is there exposed to the air. You've got no trees breaking the wind, so you have steady wind that is blowing down it, little rain, and what happens to that soil? It gets completely dried out and depleted, right? Think about if you get water on your skin. If you blow on it, the differential in pressure will make the water evaporate. So this soil gets completely dried out, and these farmers continue to farm on it, which sucks even more moisture out of the soil and all the nutrients. Okay, that's the setup. So in the mid-1930s, like around 1936, you had this happen. The Dust Bowl. So in the yellow that you see here, you had these massive windstorms in the middle of this drought with this incredibly dried out powdery. I mean, this soil had gotten down to the consistency of like baby powder, and I'm not exaggerating about that. With no moisture, nutrients depleted in it, all through this yellow area, from parts of Montana, North Dakota, all the way down deep into Texas, and from the Missouri here, Arkansas, all the way out to parts of Colorado and New Mexico. The area here in the red was the most, the severest damage, the most in the way of windstorms. Now, we talk about this windstorm, a dust storm, dust bowl. Okay, so it blew a little soil into the air. Understand what this looked like. This is an unretouched photograph of a typical dust storm. Look at you got some people down here, look at the size of the houses. And this is a solid wall of moving earth. South Dakota wasn't as hard hit as some other places, and yet 1934, this is a dust storm in South Dakota. And there you got what looks like a church or something, and this is what's called a grain elevator over here. So this was a big tall silo. And look at the size of this. This is another dust storm from about the same period. This is a small town. I think this is in Oklahoma. And there you see, you got a school. This is a 3-story school over here. Actually, I think this is actually a 5-story school because these are double stories. And this is coming in at this town. Now, this is a farm after one of these dust storms has rolled through. And you can see, right, so this is one of those big old-fashioned cars. They sat much higher off the ground than our modern cars do. And you can see you're all up to the windshield here in dust, buried in dust. This is a wagon, right? So you can see how deeply, and this is millions and millions of pounds of dust. And the dust, by the way, the soil that's moved is useless. It's got no nutrients in it. It's powder. There's no way to farm it. So it's not like, well, you just farm on top of this or something. This is an incredible mess. The result of this was, of course, the Okies. And the Okies, actually, this is not the photo I wanted. This is the correct photo. The Okies were Oklahomans. Not everybody who moved out of this was from Oklahoma, but because there were parts of Oklahoma that really got the most severely hit, a lot of Oklahomans moved, about 6% of the total population, which is a lot of people to move. The Okies left, packed up whatever they had. Remember, 1934, 35, 36, we are in the depths of the Depression in a community that has been suffering from the Depression as farmers for 10 years already. Many of these people were left with almost nothing. And so they packed up whatever they had, their mattresses, their clothes, whatever, onto a truck, a car, whatever they could find to move. And they took off and went to California. The hope was that in California they would find something better. California had not been hit with the same weather problems. It was, you may not think of California as an agricultural state because New Yorkers always think of, Los Angeles. But California is a rather large state, and a huge percentage of its life, even today, is farming. Fruit and vegetable farms, mostly. Also things like almond farms, things like that, orchards. But, these people thought, well, I'm a farmer here, maybe I can get a job working on a farm there, and so they packed up and moved. One of the most famous pictures in the Great Depression is this one. Dorothea Lange was sent out as a photographer to document what was going on in the country during the Depression. And she found one of these families that had moved to California, hoping to get jobs as day laborers, working, in this case, picking peas from the pea vines. Peas grow on a kind of vine in California. This is Florence Tompson, although her name was not well known until many, many, many years later. Dorothea Lange was one of the greatest photographers in American history, and she took a series of photos of this woman and her family, and this was the one that became famous. Because there is this mom, and this is all real. This is not a studio portrait or something. This is a mom she found terrified about the future for her family. She's got her little kids here who are filthy, dirty, and half starving, and she's trying to keep them together. I just want to point out to you, she did actually survive the Depression, and so did her kids. And so in 1979, they did a documentary about this and found this woman. She was still around, and that's her there. And these are the two kids, and this was the little baby over here, and they sort of reproduced the photo. Now, that's a long way to go for this one question here, to get back to it, about the Dust Bowl in 1936. The situation in this photograph occurred in which region? The Great Plains is the correct answer there. The Dust Bowl had nothing to do with the Northeast. The Northeast is completely different climate. Rocky Mountains, no, you don't really farm in the Rocky Mountains. And the Ohio River Valley that you're talking about, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, again, different climate, different set of problems. They had flooding and things there, but they didn't have this problem. Now, I went into great detail. This was a really ridiculously easy question here, because you never know. The question could come up covering anything I have just covered. You know, what was this Dust Bowl thing about, and where does it fit into the history of the Depression? Okay, we move on then. 28, we've got a chart. Consumer spending in billions on selected items and total value of stock, 1929 to 1933. Now, when you get a chart like this, first thing is figure out what the hell is it talking about and what's going on. 1929 is the last year before the Great Depression. The stock market crash happens, as you know, in October of 29, but the sort of the collapse of the economy, the average economy, takes an into the 1930s, because the end of October, it's really November, December, it's only 2 months there, and the economy really goes into decline in January, February, March of 30. So 29 is the last year before the Depression. 33 is the first year of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Herbert Hoover is president, 29, 30, 31, 32. 32 is the presidential election. Hoover loses. Roosevelt wins, but Roosevelt doesn't take the oath of office until 1933. 33 is really, depending on how you measure it, is one of the worst years in the Depression. It's certainly one of the worst years. It is in some ways the worst of them. So we're looking at from just before the Depression to the very depths of it. So consumer spending. Okay, so how much did Americans spend on food? You go from 19.5 to 11.5. So almost 20 to 12. Not quite a cut of half. So it's a little more than half. Housing, 11.5 billion, to 7.9. So almost 12 to almost 8. And remember, this is consumer spending. So people are spending a lot less on food. One is they're buying less of it. Two is they are buying more staple items, if you like. So no more luxury stuff, no more fancy stuff, a lot less meat, which would have been more expensive. People are sticking to really basics. The housing, and therefore you can make, there's some adjustment. I just point out to you, because you're smart guys, there's some adjustment that you can make in food. Like if you're used to having steak 4 times a week, you can switch to peanut butter sandwiches. That's going to cut the amount you spend on food. When it comes to housing, there's only so much you can cut the housing. If you're paying rent for an apartment, even if you move to a smaller apartment, there's only so far you can cut that rent. Clothing, 11.2 to 5.4, so almost half. Again, clothing you have some control over. Back in those days, nobody threw anything out. You know, you guys are used to, if something wears out, you throw it out, you get a new one. And even if it doesn't wear out, if it goes out of fashion, you buy a new one. Back then, you repaired. So if you had a pair of pants and it started to wear through, you put a patch on it. You didn't buy new. You guys, you walk around in your sneakers, it wouldn't occur to you to get sneakers repaired, really. In those days, you took shoes, and when they started to wear through, if you had a little bit of money, you went to the shoemaker guy, and there were little shoe shops all over, and he would put a new sole on it. And if you didn't have the money, you stuffed the shoe with things like newspaper or cardboard to make do. Automobiles, 2.6 billion to 0.8 billion. It drops by 3/4. Why? Nobody's got the money to buy. Nobody's got the money to buy gas. So if the car fell apart, you lived without it. If the car was old, you held it together, sometimes literally with like strings to keep it running as long as you could. You didn't, buy a new car because the latest model had come out. And again, that's something you have a fair amount of control over. This is kind of sad. Medical care, 2.9 billion to 1.9 billion. Again, there's only so far you can cut medical care. If you're sick, you're going to have to do something. But that's going from 3 to 2, so that's about a third cut. And a lot of that is people who really should have gone to doctors, and simply because they could not afford it, didn't get help. And this is one of the problems with people in poverty. People in poverty have much higher rates of all kinds of medical problems, in part because they don't go to the doctor until it becomes too late to do much, or until what was a small problem has ballooned into something really major. Philanthropy, that is the amount of money people were giving to charity. And that, interestingly, goes from 1.2 billion to 0.8 billion. So it's a drop of only about 25%. So a lot of people continued to try to give what they could to good causes. Now, notice about the value of shares on the stock market. 1929, just before you get into the Depression, it's almost $90 billion. 1933, it's $22 billion. In other words, the total value of the American stock market dropped from 90 to 22. That's over 2/3, almost a 3/4 drop. That's 75%, almost about a 70% drop. That's enormous. Okay, this is not like the others. This is telling you the value of businesses in America on the stock exchange. This is telling you about the spending habits of Americans, so don't get the two confused. All right, what conclusion is best supported by the information on the chart? Once again, when you see a question like this, do not answer what you know, answer what the chart says. So, and this is an important point. And it's not just a sort of a test-taking trick. As a historian, there's one thing to know about what's been going on, or what you think you know about what's going on. There's another thing to say, what does this piece of evidence actually tell me? Here they're asking, not your general knowledge. What can be supported by this particular piece of evidence? Okay. Business advertising had succeeded in selling more products. There is no reference on this chart to advertising. And what you see is fewer products, or at least less money being spent on products. So that can't possibly be the case here. Violence by labor had increased throughout the country. Once again, there's no reference on this chart to unions at all. And what they're talking about with labor there is labor unions. So the issue of violent strikes, that sort of thing, there's not a single piece of information on here about it. The stock market had recovered in 1933. Well, that's pretty easy. No. The value had dropped by 3/4. The stock market would not reach its 1929 values until after World War II. So that's not going to happen. Economic conditions had become worse. That's the only thing you can say from this chart. The population of the country in 4 years had not changed that much. In a period of time like that, the population of any country, and I can tell you in this case the United States, is going to go up a little bit because people are having kids, or might drop a little bit because people are having fewer kids and more people are dying for some reason, but it's not going to change that much in 4 years. So for food, the amount spent on food to go from 20 billion to just over 10 billion in 4 years tells you it's not because there are fewer people buying food, it's because people are buying less. And why do people buy less food? Because they can't buy more. So that is a clue there that economic conditions become worse. Once again, this is a pretty stupidly easy question because you guys are smart guys. I do it in this detail, though, because if you follow that method of picking apart what you can tell from this chart, then when you get something more complicated, you'll be able to do it. Okay, question 29 here. They give you a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, address at Chautauqua, New York, August 14th, 1936. Now, you should know enough of your history to know. 1936, we contextualize this first, right? 1936, you are in the middle of the Depression. FDR is president. Well, we know this. FDR has been president now for several years. It'd be nice if you remembered that August of 36, he would be looking at re-election in November of 36. So he's kind of a little bit on the campaign trail here, right? You might not know or might not remember that Chautauqua, New York, Chautauqua is a small town upstate. It's not much of a place. But it is was a summertime resort for thinkers. So a lot of people would go up to this town, Chautauqua. There were a bunch of hotels in there and so on. It was a nice, pleasant town in the middle of summer. It was cool, upstate New York. It's nice. What did you do in the evenings there? They had all of these famous authors, politicians, thinkers, artists, who would come and give talks and give lectures and teach sort of mini courses. So if you were the kind of person who wanted to debate politics or, you were a big book reader or better your mind, Chautauqua was a place to do it. And so Roosevelt shows up there and is invited to give a speech. Okay. So what does he say? 36, by the way, we should also point out, you should remember, is what? Before World War II. U.S. enters World War II December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The war by then had been going on since 39, September 1st, when Hitler invades Poland. So we're 3 years before that. On the other hand, what has been happening? Hitler is on the rise in Europe, in Germany. Mussolini has long been running the show in Italy, and so there's already a feel in the world that things are not looking good. Okay. Roosevelt's talk here. Of all the nations of the world today, we are in many ways most singularly blessed. Our closest neighbors are good neighbors. If there are remoter nations that wish us not good, but ill, they know that we are strong. They know that we can and will defend ourselves and defend our neighborhood. We seek to dominate no other nation. We ask no territorial expansion. We oppose imperialism. We desire reduction in world armaments. Okay. Let's just point out a couple of things about this talk. Phrase there, our closest neighbors are good neighbors. It's not directly asked in the question, but one thing you should know about is Roosevelt's, quote, good neighbor policy. So what was we contrast it with Theodore Roosevelt's, and let me pull up a thing here. So notice U.S. policy toward Latin America. Teddy Roosevelt, big stick, and Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So we remember the Monroe Doctrine from way back early 1800s. What was the Monroe Doctrine? James Monroe said, the Western Hemisphere is closed to new colonization by Europe. This was at the time that Simón Bolívar had led a series of revolutions and inspired revolutions all through Central and South America. And a lot of countries had won their independence from particularly Spain, but a lot of colonies were looking for independence from Spain, France, etc. Monroe had said, these newly emerged, this is now, we're talking the very early 1800s, yeah? The 1820s. Monroe had said, these new republics are to be left alone. We, the United States, will protect them from Europe trying to recolonize them. In return, Monroe said, we have no interest in getting involved in European affairs. Teddy Roosevelt, now 80 years later, 1900, talks about this big stick policy and the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary was, not only would we protect these Central and South American countries from Europe, we will protect them from themselves, meaning we will interfere in the internal affairs of these Latin American countries when we think their governments are not running the show properly. Teddy was afraid that a corrupt government in Central American country, for instance, would become so dependent on European money that the Europeans would have an excuse to come in and take it back over again. Really, Roosevelt wanted to turn them all into sort of client states of the United States. And so he said, we will speak softly but carry a big stick. That is, we'll reach out to those governments and tell them what they should do, and if they don't listen, we will send in our military, which he did on occasion. Teddy Roosevelt is followed by Taft, William Howard Taft, and his dollar diplomacy. What was that about? Taft said, here's what we can do to keep these countries in line. We will make them economically dependent on the United States. Taft got U.S. businesses and U.S. banks to invest tons of money in these countries and to loan them tons of money. Well, you're kind of owned by the guy you owe money to. So these countries became dependent on the United States. And once again, Taft was not above using the military to enforce U.S. policies there. Taft is followed by Woodrow Wilson, who followed what he called a path of moral diplomacy. So he used the moral force of his arguments about the goodness of American democracy and doing things the American way to convince these Central and South American and Caribbean countries to do what the United States wanted. But once again, Wilson sent in the U.S. Marines on several occasions to take over countries that were not doing things his way. Okay, 1920s, you have Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, who kind of don't pay much attention to South America. Then you get FDR. FDR realizes that he needs to make these Central and South American countries allies of the United States, friendly to the United States. He sees what's going on in Europe, and he realizes that these countries could find it advantageous to be doing business with the newly emerging economy in Nazi Germany, with Italy, which is trying to grow its colonial empire, and with Japan, believe it or not. Japan was also looking to trade with some of the countries like Argentina on the west coast of, and Chile, I should say, on the west coast of, through the west coast of South America. So FDR said, what we want to show these countries is that we are good neighbors. And that's not God neighbors, good neighbors. That we are their buddies, that we are their friends. And if they stay friendly to us, then they won't be. We don't have to worry about them falling in with the Nazis or somebody like that. So the good neighbor policy was this attempt to win over the friendship of Central and South American countries. So it's interesting there that that phrase comes up. Our closest neighbors, therefore, are good neighbors. He means Central and South America. If there are more distant nations, remoter nations, that wish us not good but ill, they know that we are strong. They know that we can and will defend ourselves and defend our neighborhood. So what he's talking about is places perhaps like Japan and Germany. We're nowhere near the war yet, but you can hear the rumblings. And he's saying, don't worry, they are aware how powerful and strong we are, and that we will stand up for ourselves and our neighborhood, meaning Central and South America. So we don't have to worry about them coming after us either. They may not like us, but they're not going to come after us. He says, we seek to dominate no other nation. And he's making a reference, because Hitler has already started moving into places like Austria and the Rhineland and Czechoslovakia. We ask no territorial expansion. We oppose imperialism. We desire a reduction in world armaments. Okay, so which policy is FDR supporting in this speech? He's not talking about increasing foreign aid, because he doesn't talk about that at all. A growth in military spending. You might say that, but he's not saying here, notice, that we should be strong or that we have to get strong. He says we are strong. So he's not asking for an increase in military spending. He's telling you we already are spending enough to defend ourselves. Increase in foreign aid. No, he doesn't really talk about, he says being good neighbors, but he doesn't talk about giving anybody else any money. So the best choice is neutrality in foreign relations. He's saying, look, we're not looking to conquer anything. We're not looking to have colonies. We are looking to reduce everybody's weapons. We don't want to get into it, but we will defend ourselves to keep ourselves out of it. So the best choice here really is neutrality in foreign relations. Although even in that neutrality, you can see Roosevelt in the background setting you up for the day when we're going to have to get involved. Okay, let's move on. And here we have a political cartoon. So let's remember what this is about. And I will tell you, the Regents exam loves to put a cartoon about this very particular issue. For some reason, it comes up often. Packed court, you see here, right? Okay, so what is going on here? You've got Uncle Sam, right? So the USA. You got FDR, and people would have instantly recognized that face, the big chin and the big grin and the little glasses. They would have known that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt right away. Now, what is this referring to in this packed court? We want a ventriloquist act in the Supreme Court. So FDR comes into office 1933, and he starts his New Deal, yes? And we know that it's that alphabet soup of programs: the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the Public Works Administration, the PWA, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. That's why it was called the alphabet soup, because he starts dozens of these programs, organizations, and departments in the first few months, all about, as you remember, and when you think about the Depression and the New Deal particularly, I'll move this over, New Deal, you always think about relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, dealing with the immediate emergency that the country is in. Recovery, once you get out of the people who this minute are starving in the country, how do we then recover the economy? How do we restart the economy? And reform, how do we change the rules of the economy so that this doesn't happen again? So all of these programs are, fall into some category of this. So, for instance, the Public Works Administration was about both relief and recovery. It was picking out government work, building a road, building a library, building a post office, building a dam, and then hiring construction workers, electricians, masons, clerks, architects, engineers, all the people you needed to actually do the work of building this thing. All those guys were out of work, so it gave them all a job and a salary for a while. And at the end of it, you wound up with a new road, which you hoped could be used for better transportation, more trucks moving, help the economy. So relief, recovery, and reform was things like the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which has made it almost impossible for a bank to fail. And if a bank does go, we've never had a bank fail under FDIC, not since the 30s, but even if one were to, you have insurance. You're guaranteed you're going to get your money out of your savings account, so you didn't lose your whole life savings. So whenever and I'm not going to do the whole New Deal with this question, but when you look at New Deal programs, you're always thinking about relief, fixing the immediate need, emergency crisis of Americans at that moment, recovery, pushing money into the economy to get the economy moving again, and reform, changing the rules of the economy so that you couldn't have another crash like we did. One of the programs FDR comes up with is called the National Recovery Act, the NRA. Has nothing to do with the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Act. Okay, so the National Recovery Act created the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. And this was one of the posters they used. You see the Blue Eagle. The Blue Eagle was the symbol of the NRA. The point of the National Recovery Act was it gave the government the power to set wages and prices. So it told industry how much they had to pay workers per hour to do their job, and it told industry how much they were allowed to charge for their goods. The purpose of it was to prevent inflation. If you pay workers, if you don't pay them enough, obviously they have trouble living. If you pay them too much, prices start to go up too. So they wanted to control wages and prices. Roosevelt came up with this idea. And if you were a member of the NRA, if your business belonged to the NRA, you were encouraged to put these posters in your window. We do our part. If any of you are old movie fans, if you ever watched Turner Classic Movies, TCM, a lot of the old movies of the 1930s, the end titles, the end credits will include, this Blue Eagle because everybody wanted to be on board with it. Well, not everybody wanted to be on board with it. There were a lot of people who said, wait a minute. It's one thing for the government to have a bunch of construction projects and buy concrete and bricks and, wire and stuff from private companies to try to help the economy move. It's another thing to set a kind of general minimum wage, the way we do now, which they did during the Depression. But it's something completely different for the government to be controlling industry to the point where they're telling them what they must pay as a wage and controlling what they're allowed to charge in a price. That's making the government really the ultimate ruler of the economy, and that's socialism. And you have a right in the United States to private property. You have a right to private industry. The government can make rules to make sure the competition is real and fair, but they're not supposed to be running your business for you. And this steps over a line. So they filed a bunch of people filed a case with the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had gone along with most of Roosevelt's program before this. It was extraordinary. It gave the federal government powers. This is before the NRA. Roosevelt's programs had given the federal government powers it had never had before. It gave the president extraordinary authority. On the other hand, the country was dealing with a depression so powerful that a quarter to a third of Americans were out of work, and people were literally starving to death. The Supreme Court, though, said that the National Recovery Act went too far. Roosevelt was asking for too much power with this, and therefore it is unconstitutional. And they struck down the NRA. Well, how did FDR respond to this? He was furious. So he comes up with an idea. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, right? Who said that? Who decided there are 9 justices? And you, my smart boys, so you know, it's not in the Constitution. Constitution, Article 3 says, there shall be a Supreme Court, which shall include the Chief Justice of the United States and associate justices, period. Well, that word associate justices is plural, which means you have to have at least 2. So you could have 3 judges, Chief Justice and 2 associates. So who decided we have 9? Congress. Originally, Congress set the number of justices at 5. Then we increased it to 7. And then finally, they increased it around the time of the Civil War to 9. And we've had 9 justices ever since. FDR proposes that Congress add justices to the Supreme Court. Why? So then he would get to appoint another handful of them so that they would rule in his favor. That's called packing a court. If you're getting a decision that you don't like, well, you simply appoint more judges until you've appointed a majority of guys who agree with you. And that was the idea. That did not go over well with people, though. If I pull this up here, okay. So Roosevelt wanted to add another few justices to the court so that he would be sure to have a majority and basically make the Supreme Court a rubber stamp for whatever the hell he wanted to do. That would have required the U.S. Senate to go along with it. You really should have had both houses, but you could have just done it with the Senate. He could have simply appointed a judge, and the Senate could have approved it, and that would have effectively created another seat. The Senate, though, which had gone along with just about everything Roosevelt wanted, said, wait a minute. That's too far. Now FDR is starting to screw around with the basic institutions of our government. And whether you like the decision of the Supreme Court or not, when you start screwing around with the basic institution of the Supreme Court itself, you're in very dangerous territory. That starts to look dictatorial. So the U.S. Senate turned him down. But in 1937, it was a very hot issue. And so you often get a cartoon like this, where you've got them mocking Roosevelt, really, for wanting to appoint a bunch of puppets to the Supreme Court who would always give him that majority. Okay, so this 1937 cartoon is criticizing President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plan to increase the number of justices on the court. One reason FDR's proposed the plan shown was that the Supreme Court had declared parts of key New Deal programs, particularly the National Recovery Act, unconstitutional. Many members of Congress opposed the plan because it would upset the system of checks and balances that we hold so sacred that we're even willing to live with it when we don't like the results for the sake of the greater good that they represent. Okay, I'm going to leave it there with this video, and we'll pick up with question 33 next time. Good neighbor policy.